Almost 2 years into the pandemic and we're still spending big and approving drugs quickly on COVID. But even in the midst of a new variant, is it time to change course? Last month, the UK became the first country in the world to approve the COVID antiviral drug molnupiravir. But tonight, we examine whether it can really deliver fully on early promises and whether, when it comes to COVID, we're kicking the tires hard enough before splashing the cash. Also tonight, the Duchess of Sussex wins this round of a privacy battle with the Mail on Sunday and says she's been patient in the face of deception, intimidation and calculated attacks. She's won this battle, but will she and Prince Harry win their war against the tabloids? And the case of the star Chinese tennis player Peng Shuai, who disappeared last month in China, has highlighted the pervasiveness of the repressive regime. We speak to a Chinese business mogul and author whose former wife disappeared entirely 4 years ago. Good evening. Since the start of the COVID pandemic, we've become used to hearing sums of money used to deal with it, be it vaccines or ventilators or logistics or extra for the NHS or furlough, in the hundreds of millions or even billions of pounds. The government and medical regulators were widely applauded for the speed with which they invested in and then approved the use of vaccines, often before the full data on their impact could be known. Well, nearly 2 years into the pandemic, some in medicine believe we might be approaching the time to return to a more normal system of regulation and spending. In a moment, we'll be hearing from a health correspondent, Deb Cohen. But first, as we try to calibrate the threat posed by Omicron, the messaging coming from our politicians is increasingly coming under scrutiny. I'm joined now by policy editor Lewis Goodo. Lewis, you're in Bexley for the by-election. We'll come to you about that in a few minutes' time. But first, what has been developing about what we're meant to do, not meant to do, being advised to do, not advised to do by the government?
Well, as you say, Kirsty, I'm here in Bexley for the by-election where voters will be deciding on a whole range of issues that the government is facing, whether that is alleged Conservative or government corruption, whether that's the situation in the Channel or indeed the government's handling of the pandemic. And one of the principal themes around the government's handling of the pandemic this week has been so-called, what many people, critics are saying, is mixed messaging from the government about the Omicron variant. Let's just go through what we've had this week. Bear in mind, of course, there is an unusual thing about at the moment, or an unusual situation in that previously when there has been criticism of the government for mixed messaging, there has at least been some guidance there to look at. As things stand now, according to official government guidance, short of what we've now got in terms of face masks, there basically isn't very much. Certainly in England anyway, it's basically go about your lives as normal. And yet with the Omicron variant this week, we've had a series of rather different messages from the government. So, for example, earlier this week we had Gillian Keegan, the health minister, saying we very much hope we have a Christmas as normal this year. Fine. But then Jenny Harries, of course, said that people should be eliminating unnecessary social interaction, whatever that means. Number 10 later rode back from that, saying that that wasn't required. She wasn't speaking for the government. The PM then said we don't want people to cancel Christmas events like nativity plays and Christmas parties. The health secretary later then said that people should be taking a lateral flow test before attending Christmas parties. Again, that's not in any sort of government guidance. While Work and Pensions Secretary Therese Coffey last night said in a sentence I never thought I'd ever say on Newsnight that people should avoid snogging under the mistletoe. Again, nothing in the guidance as far as I know about that. And then George Freeman, the Science Minister, said today that his Christmas party anyway was unlikely to go ahead, and it would probably go ahead via Zoom. Now, you might forgive ministers for, like the rest of us, being a little bit confused about Omicron. It is, of course, something new, and we don't have much information about it. But I think the public, perhaps reasonably, could be said to think, well, if ministers aren't sure, then how on earth can they be expected to?
Lewis, for now, thanks very much. Well, we'll talk messaging shortly, but first we've had what's felt like a blizzard of announcements of late regarding vaccine boosters and drugs to treat COVID. Our health editor, Deb Cohen, has been looking at the UK's buying of antiviral drugs to treat COVID.
The government's vaccine gamble, spending big and taking risks when so much was unknown, paid off. By any measure, it's been a huge success. And now we're still spending big and spending early on other treatments, at times before we've got the full data. But some in healthcare now believe it might be time to think again. Only today the government announced a new drug to treat COVID. GSK's sotrovimab. The UK has ordered 100,000 doses. It is claimed to reduce the risk of those with COVID needing to go to hospital by 79%, and it's given by an intravenous infusion that takes 30 minutes. It sounds great, but some worry actually deploying it may not be so simple.
So we're getting these trials announced in unvaccinated people, and that's not the reality in the United Kingdom. GPs are overwhelmed. We can't expect British patients to notice their symptoms, get tested, get treated within 5 days of symptoms. That is so quick. It's very hard to do that. And this intravenous infusion that it involves, intravenous infusion is a difficult procedure. It's very hard for GPs to take that on as well. Who's actually going to do that?
We know much of this because the full trial was published recently. This wasn't the case when the UK regulator approved another drug, molnupiravir. A press release from the company that markets it, Merck, announced that it would reduce hospitalisations or deaths in high-risk people by 50%. At the time, Newsnight was cautious about this statement because we hadn't seen any data and we still had questions about how well the drug would work in people who had been vaccinated or who had antibodies following a COVID infection. And now, over in America, further data from a key clinical trial have been presented to the drug regulator there. These data show the reduction in hospitalisations dropped to 30%, and that wasn't all.
With Merck and molnupiravir, we hear the good news by press release. We don't hear the bad news. We've heard about one study where there was a 50% reduction in hospitalisation early on. Later on in that study, there was no benefit in the second half. It shows some benefit for people who are antibody negative. Now, in the UK, most people will be vaccinated, they'll be antibody positive. If you look at the antibody positive people in the study, there's no benefit at all. So why would we use this drug for vaccinated people in the United Kingdom? Is there actually any use?
Merck said it is not yet clear why such a difference was observed in the two parts of the study, but they're confident in the clinical data for molnupiravir, which consistently showed a benefit when taken as directed within 5 days of symptoms. The UK was the first in the world to approve molnupiravir and bought around 480,000 doses, announcing it would reduce hospitalisations by 50%. We don't know how much the UK has paid, but other similar countries have paid £500 for a course of treatment.
It's at the upper end of expenditures on a single drug, undoubtedly. And it's okay if it was going to produce the benefit that's expected. In times of crisis at the beginning of the pandemic, you want to move quickly because of the costs of moving slowly. But we're not in that state anymore. We're now in a position where we do have the time to wait for better data. And one has to ask why that didn't happen this time.
Some argue that it's worth spending big on drugs and vaccines just in case the current crop aren't as effective against emerging variants. But others say we need to start thinking about the impact of doing this. There are lots of other areas of health that need funding too, and people with other conditions could miss out.
We've got to start being responsible. We're out of crisis mode now. We're moving into endemic mode, and we're going to see new variants turning up, and we can't, every time there's a new variant, throw hundreds of millions or billions of pounds at a technological response. That's not sustainable. We need to sort of revert to the usual evidence-based, careful assessment of how to spend the monies that we have.
Hello, good morning.
The government's vaccine strategy paid big dividends, and unknowns, not least new variants, undoubtedly lie ahead. But questions remain over the long-term wisdom of gambling as a strategy.
Deb Cohen. Well, in a moment, we'll hear from Professor Neil Ferguson, the man whose modelling informed the government's original coronavirus lockdown. But first, to discuss where we spend precious health resources, I'm joined by Dr. Pippa Anderson, a Professor of Health Economics who works across 3 Welsh universities, Bangor, Swansea and Cardiff. Professor Anderson, thank you for joining us tonight. I mean, you know, we heard there from Professor Andrew Hill, you know, the cost of intravenous procedures. We hear how the studies that work well, we hear about the studies that work badly or have bad results we don't hear about. Are we spending money on COVID in the best possible way?
Well, that's a really good question. And I don't think I can answer that in a straightforward way because it is very complex. But my perspective on this as a health economist is that we're not looking wide enough across of what the impact of COVID has been. And we are now into a chronic health problem. It's going to be with us for some time. So we have to look at spending our resources much more widely and look at where COVID has indirectly had consequences for people who need health and care, people who were cancelled, and that's where we should be thinking about spending our money now to help them catch up and get their care.
But is it possible to identify big mistakes or not, or pinpoint areas where you think there has been profligacy unnecessarily?
Absolutely. As long as this can be done without blame, just learning from experience and inspecting what's happened. If you invest healthcare resources, you should look at outcomes and see what those outcomes were and what was it worth it, and learn from that experience, and just move on, because this will happen again. And if only we could harvest these experiences and learn from them, we'll all be better off.
Well, for example, give me an example of somewhere where you think there was unnecessary spending.
My example would be the reduction of care for people with chronic diseases, care for the elderly when the pandemic hit.
Yeah. So is it possible to calibrate COVID spending the same way that you calibrate spending and treatment on cancer, for example? Or are we still in a kind of unpredictable phase of COVID and we can't do that?
At this stage, because we have such fantastic electronic systems now and electronic patient records and big data, we can, and we are doing that. You know, my own groups are working on this at the moment. So we are looking at this, we can learn, and we must.
But I'm sorry, we've got a problem with the sound, but I do want to ask this last question. Even if we have a robust framework, the unknown surely is the way that politicians can ride roughshod over that, presumably, if they feel the need arises. And is that what happens? Or do you think we need to, and do you think we need to have a framework that is kind of resistant to politics?
Yes, absolutely. We must not let politics get in the way of coming back from the pandemic. And if we're going to talk about levelling up, which politicians do, the levelling up of healthcare. And it must be, include all stakeholders, must be politically neutral if we are to get out of this and bring back balance and, you know, equitable and fair distribution of resources.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, earlier I sat down with Professor Neil Ferguson, head of the Disease Outbreak Analysis and Modelling Group at Imperial College in London, and who also sits on SAGE. I asked him at what point we should stop treating COVID as an emergency.
I think we've been close to that point, at least in the UK, for some months. I mean, we are living with a high rate of infection, but it doesn't mean that it will never be an emergency again. I mean, the concern about Omicron is that there is some risk that it escapes immunity to the extent we get an overwhelming wave of infections, which threatens healthcare capacity.
You, though, thought it would be over by October at one point. Was that because you hadn't sort of modelled the idea of increasing numbers of variants? Or were you just being overly optimistic?
I mean, I don't remember ever saying it would be over by October, but certainly we were all hopeful, particularly back in the spring when we had the Alpha variant, that with the level of vaccination we've now reached, we would be at much lower case numbers. And then, of course, we had the Delta variant, which partly evaded vaccine immunity itself, but mostly was a lot more transmissible, which is why we're still at 50,000 cases. But we're still in a much, much better place now than we were a year ago.
So we're in a situation now where we're coming to December, January. What should we do? Should we do the same amount of socialising? Should we do less socialising? And what do you think by way of people adhering to what's even suggested to them?
I mean, I don't think I'm here to tell people what they should do. What I would say is at the moment, over 99% of COVID cases in the UK are Delta. The rollout of boosters is going very well and is having a really significant effect on hospitalisations and deaths. We will know in the next 2 to 3 weeks how much of a risk Omicron will pose. Still, in 2 to 3 weeks' time, even in the worst case, the absolute numbers of cases per day from Omicron will still be only a small fraction of Delta. And so we have some time to evaluate the threat it poses before we jump to what do we need to do at Christmas.
But people have to make decisions in their lives about who they socialise with at Christmas.
I think people can make their own judgments about risk. The challenge at the moment is we don't quite know what that risk is. I would also make a more general point. People talk about Christmas as if there's an enormous increase in population mixing in contact rates at Christmas. Actually, the reverse is true. There's less mixing at Christmas. People stay home, they mix with close family and with friends, but they don't go to work and they don't go to school. And so actually Christmas tends to decrease infection rates for most diseases like, for instance, flu, rather than increase it.
So would modelling suggest then that people just go about their daily lives the way they would normally do, and we don't need to have these cautions to socialise maybe less, don't have big parties?
I kind of feel my role specifically is to evaluate the level of risk posed by this variant, which we don't know at the moment. We have some reason to believe it could be serious, but what that means in terms of the consequences for the pandemic and the potential need for additional control measures is not yet known. I think we've done the most important thing, which is accelerate boosters, because we don't have certainty, but we have a good deal of confidence that people who've had their third dose will have a high level of protection against at least severe disease, even with Omicron.
So, again, if people are to be sensible and to be prudent, whatever, what are the chances of adherence if the government did start to say rules? I mean, we've all had experience of maybe not quite following the rules exactly, but what would the position be, do you think, if the government said, socialise in your house but with no more than 7 people? Would people adhere to it this time around?
I'm not a behavioural scientist. I mean, my knowledge of... So I can't give you a definitive answer. You'd be better talking to somebody who is a psychologist and studies these things. I think the experience throughout the pandemic is that the great majority of people, when given that sort of guidance, take it seriously and adhere more or less to it. So we see an effect of recommendations on population behaviour, and we have seen it throughout the pandemic.
So what you seem to be saying, just to finish, is that it's too early to have restrictions. You need to wait 2 or 3 more weeks. That seems to be what you're saying.
I think restrictions are more likely to be followed and accepted, and there's a lot of political, let's say, diversity of opinions around the merits and the costs of restrictions. But if we actually have more definitive data which says this really does pose this particular threat, this is likely to happen if we don't do something.
So therefore, nothing that anyone can do in the next 2 or 3 weeks is going to impact on that. That's really my point.
Yes, I mean, so that is an important point. Of course, we could go into lockdown tomorrow and stop transmission. There's an enormous cost to that, and it would be unwarranted in terms of the benefits it would bring. But undoubtedly, over the next few weeks, we expect to see Omicron case numbers rise, but not to the level whereby it's irreversible.
Ferguson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
The fact that more snow is due to hit Scotland tomorrow is just piling on more woe for the thousands still without any power in the north of the country and in the north of England after Storm Arwen, roughly 16,000 homes. A major incident has been declared in County Durham and more than 100 military personnel have been deployed in Grampian region. So why have the utility companies failed to restore power for what will be a week tomorrow? And what do we know about the resilience of our networks? Our economics editor Ben Chu is at the wall. Ben.
Yes, Kirsty, 6 days after Storm Arwen swept in and tore down power lines, some 16,000 homes in Scotland and the north of England are still without electricity. Northern Power Grid, which serves the northeast of England, has come in for particular criticism for those long delays in restoring power and also for poor communication to those affected. Here's what the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, told Parliament yesterday.
When the power is back up and back to normal, We, of course, in BEIS will be looking at the lessons that we can learn from Storm Arwen in order to build an even more resilient power system in the future.
Some have suggested this episode, along with spiking energy bills and the collapse of a host of domestic supplier firms, raises troubling questions about the security of our national energy system. So how concerned should we be, and how do we build a resilient power system? Well, before we get into that, it's worth establishing exactly what Northern Power Grid is. It's what's known as a distribution network operator. While the national grid delivers electricity along the spine of the UK via large pylons, DNOs are responsible for the smaller cables that deliver power directly to people's homes. There are 6 across the UK, covering 14 separate regions over which they have a monopoly. And you can see the area covered by Northern Power Grid in yellow. They're all private companies, but as monopoly utilities, they are, as you would expect, regulated by the energy regulator Ofgem. Now, some analysts have been asking if, in the aftermath of Storm Arwen, whether that raises questions about how these firms have been regulated. Well, despite the hardship experienced by thousands in recent days, experts say there's no compelling evidence that these firms have been underinvesting in maintaining their networks or their emergency response capabilities. However, with the power cuts shining a light on regulation issues, it's worth noting some have argued the regulator has allowed their owners to extract excessive profits. In its most recent report, Northern Power Grid was projecting a 6.7% return on equity, a key measure of profitability. Citizens Advice argues this is simply too high, given the collapse in market interest rates in recent years and the fact that these companies face negligible commercial risk. The group estimates energy firms are receiving a £7.5 billion windfall because Ofgem effectively got it wrong when it set their profit allowances. If this is happening, what's happening is ordinary households who are left out of pocket, paying more than they otherwise would for their energy. The failure of many domestic energy supply companies in the face of the recent gas price spike has also brought forth criticism of Ofgem's competence as a regulator. Now, on this, Ofgem told Newsnight tonight the unprecedented rise in gas prices shows we do need to go further to build an energy market that is more resilient to shocks. And on financial controls, Ofgem argued its regulation of network companies has now actually reduced the amount paid to shareholders by 35%. Now, this is all happening, of course, in the context of a debate about the speed of the shift to net zero for power. For groups like Extinction Rebellion, it's simply not happening fast enough. But the Tory-led Net Zero Scrutiny Group argues the UK's shift away from fossil fuels is itself destabling the energy system by creating an excessive reliance on intermittent wind. Let's be clear why all this matters, particularly the regulation question. We obviously need an effective energy regulator to supervise private firms to make sure the domestic energy system is resilient today. In other words, to keep the heating and lighting on. But we also need a regulator we can trust to set the right incentives for those firms to deliver the government's own target of a wholly decarbonised electricity grid by 2035. Kirsty.
Thanks, Ben. The relations between the Duke and Duchess of Sussex and elements of the press are at a sorry pass. But a court judgment today has, perhaps temporarily, shifted the balance of power towards the Sussexes. The Court of Appeal accepted a previous ruling which found that a letter from the then Meghan Markle to her father, extracts of which were published in the Mail on Sunday, was personal. The Mail on Sunday has said it is considering an application to the Supreme Court. Well, following the judgment, the Duchess of Sussex said, "While this win is precedent-setting, what matters most is that we're now collectively brave enough to reshape a tabloid industry that conditions people to be cruel and profits from the lies and pain that they create." Well, in taking on the tabloids, has the Duchess of Sussex reframed what privacy actually means, or has she let herself in for even more tabloid attention? I'm joined now by the journalist and author Kovi Bayakolo and royal expert and historian Victoria Howard. Thank you very much for joining us. Victoria Howard, first of all, is there a chance that actually this will change anything in the way the tabloids operate?
I don't think so. I think that's a very big ask for a lawsuit such as this. And of course, the newspaper group are considering taking it that step further to the Supreme Court. They really think they have a strong case. And honestly, it just feels a bit antagonistic to the tabloids. They are trying to stand up for themselves, but equally, I don't think that is working in that relationship with the media.
Now, why would you suggest that it's antagonised towards the tabloids when a lot of people would say the tabloids were antagonistic towards the Duchess of Sussex.
Absolutely, but for the royal family in particular, Meghan and Harry's relationship and the way they've been dealing with the press has been very different. You know, you've probably heard that mantra, never complain, never explain. Harry and Meghan have not been happy to settle for that.
Well, Kobe Baracolo, I mean, there was always going to be a massive interest in Meghan Markle, wasn't there? Because she was financially independent, she was a UN ambassador, she was an actor, already famous divorce, first biracial royal member of the royal family. And at first, the attention all went pretty well, and she looked like she was enjoying it.
I think initially she did, but I also think that, you know, we have to be clear that this is a person who really didn't understand the history of the royal family and the history of the institution of the monarchy. So I like to say that I think she was a bit naive going into this. That being said, I do think that the tabloids have been especially relentless, and because she is an American and because she is a biracial woman with African ancestry, Black ancestry, I don't think that we can look away from, you know, those identities in terms of how the press in particular has treated her, especially the tabloids.
Do you agree with that, Victoria?
I do. Naive is a good word to describe that. It sounds like she really was not briefed on how this works, that really they don't engage with the press in that way. They try and do things behind closed doors if they are unhappy and engage with journalists
Well, that's interesting, because would you say that was the same in the States? I mean, there isn't, to my mind, there isn't the same history of such intrusion from tabloids in the States, such relentless intrusion. Am I right?
I don't necessarily know if that is accurate, because, I mean, we're coming off a year in which we've seen the kind of scrutiny over time that Britney Spears has faced, for example. And so I do think the tabloids in the US operate similarly, but not the same. I also think that the institution of the monarchy is a very particular institution. And for me, I would say that Meghan has handled it as best as she can, but from the very beginning, again, I sort of imagined that she thought that she might sort of be able to change the way they engage with the press. And I think she was met with very shocking treatment by the tabloids.
Now, what about the point that if, in fact, the Mail on Sunday doesn't go to the Supreme Court, or goes to the Supreme Court and fails, wouldn't it be fair to say that what she might have achieved would have an impact going forward on other possible royal entanglements with the tabloids to the royals' benefit, actually, that ironically she may have helped them?
I think that's a very valid point. You know, it's very difficult to predict these things, but the royals just don't tend to deal with it that way. They tend to use those back channels, and it's, you know, lawsuits, legal action are very much the last things that they use as a defence.
But actually, the younger members of the royals have been much more robust of late, and to a certain extent, you might think have put some of the tabloids on the back foot.
Yes, and they are more willing to stand up for themselves than, you know, Prince Charles's generation, for example, which of course is a good thing. You know, having a robust press section in society, that's really important. But as public figures, they also need to toe that line to a certain extent. So for them to have, you know, that good relationship, they need the press coverage. The monarchy needs that to sustain itself. They have to have a good working relationship, and that's why I use that word antagonistic. If they have this sort of tittle-tattle with the press, they are less likely to publish those puff pieces, those good stories that cover some of the genuinely good work the royals do, you know, the charity stuff. And they focus on the gossip.
But that's quite interesting, because what you're suggesting is then that really that whole idea of a stiff upper lip has got to be going forward, rather than actually biting back and saying this is unacceptable. And I wonder how that looks in America now, Kobe. I wonder what the treatment of the Duchess of Sussex looks like in America now, what the commentary is on it.
To be honest, I think Americans have been greatly surprised, because there is sort of this idea that sometimes is also promoted, I think, by British institutions, that Britain is less racist than America in some ways. For me, I think that Meghan has won the legal battle, but there is still a cultural battle that she is going to face, and she's going to continue to face it in the press, and she's at the center of it. It is much bigger than her, and it has very much to do with, you know, in the first place, how we treat biracial women or women of color in general, women who are Black, who are codified as Black, how we treat them in the press, how we treat them in the public, especially how we police their reactions to being subject to the press in very negative, in a very negative light. So I think Meghan is still going to be at the center of that, regardless of the legal win.
Thank you both very much indeed. Now, even by the standards of recent political shocks, the idea of Labour winning tonight's by-election at Old Bexley and Sidcup seems a little far-fetched. It was, after all, a reasonably comfortable Conservative hold, even in the great Labour landslide of 1997. But could what happens when they count the votes give us some barometer of what cut-through, if any, Boris Johnson's recent Westminster travails are having? So, Lewis, you are there. Tell me what you can tell us now.
Yes, Kirsty, of course, we're all wondering whether or not this could be in a situation where you've got a Conservative government mid-term mired in accusations of sleaze, a Prime Minister who has had a torrid last few months. Could this start to feel a little bit like the 1990s? Labour, Lib Dem coming together in a tacit form of alliance, mirroring those great stonking by-elections of Wirral South and Dudley West. Is it going to be like that tonight? Well, probably not. The general feeling here is that although turnout does seem to be very low, Labour are confident they'll be able to exploit that and eat into that Conservative majority. Speaking to Conservatives here, they are quietly confident of holding on to this seat. As you say, that should be no surprise in many ways. This is a rock-solid Conservative seat. It's the sort of seat that Conservative governments have built their foundations of their majorities on over generations and generations. The late James Brokenshire had over 60% of the vote in this seat, and it is very heavily Brexit voting as well. 80% owner-occupier, very prosperous. As I say, very solid Conservative seat. I think what everyone will be looking at is to what extent Labour can start to eat in to that Conservative majority. It would require a 20% swing for them to take this seat, but if they can get a swing of 5, 6, 7%, if they can best the vote that Jeremy Corbyn got here in 2017, then Labour will claim a victory tonight. I think we will probably get to the end of this evening and have both parties claiming a bit of a victory. The Conservatives in that they will be able to say they've held on to their first by-election in 5 years. Labour that they're on the road to some recovery. I think though also Conservatives will be eyeing this a little bit nervously in looking at that turnout, because something they are far more worried about is another by-election held on December the 16th in just 2 weeks' time in Shropshire North. The former seat of Owen Paterson, of course, who's had to resign as a result of those standards allegations. Conservatives are very nervous about that seat with a very strong Lib Dem challenge. So they'll be looking at this nervously. They'll be hoping to bank this win. But I think there's no denying that that particular by-election in Shropshire could top off what has been a very difficult few months for the Conservative Party and for Boris Johnson in particular. We're expecting a result tonight, Kirsty, at about 2 a.m. So I would advise everyone to stay up.
Lewis, thanks very much. I'm sure you'll still be there. The case of Peng Shuai isn't just a reminder of the brutality of China's internal politics, but also its murkiness to the outside world. The 35-year-old tennis star disappeared for 3 weeks after she accused a top Chinese official of sexual assault. But how best to respond to influence China from the outside? The Women's Tennis Association took a hard line, suspending events in China because it has serious doubts Peng is free, safe and not subject to intimidation. Olympic bosses, by contrast, stress quiet diplomacy ahead of the Beijing Winter Games in February. Well, in a moment, I'll be speaking to Chinese businessman and author Desmond Shum, whose ex-wife disappeared 4 years ago. First, here's Yasmin Arakan.
Peng Shuai, a Chinese tennis ace and a former Wimbledon and French Open doubles champion, has rarely been seen in public since she accused former China Vice Premier Zhang Guoli of sexual assault a month ago. Peng, 35, alleged on the Weibo social media platform in November that the former Vice Premier Zhang Guoli, sharing the stage with her here, had forced her into sex during a long-term on and off relationship. 3 weeks after her allegation and much talked about disappearance, she appeared in this video call to Thomas Bach, the president of the Olympic Committee, claiming she was safe and well. In a statement today, the IOC said officials had since held a second video call with the tennis star, offering support. But the World Tennis Association chairman Steve Simon voiced doubts.
I have a hard time believing that Peng Shuai actually wrote the email we received or believes what is being attributed to her. Peng Shuai displayed incredible courage in describing an allegation of sexual assault against a former top official in the Chinese government. The WTA and the rest of the world need independent and verifiable proof that she is safe.
Tennis stars went public in shock.
This is horrifying.
We would like actually to hear like a video from her or something, like a real proof that yes, that she's all right.
On Naomi Osaka's Twitter page, she writes, "Censorship is never okay at any cost. I hope Peng Shuai and her family are safe and okay." Tennis stars of today and the past are showing solidarity with Peng. But would they be prepared to go further and call for competition boycotts? With the world's eyes on the fate of Peng Shuai and the World Tennis Association women's tournaments now suspended in China, the question is whether this could be a moment for change.
Yasmin Arkan. I'm joined now by the Chinese businessman Desmond Shum. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We'll come on to Peng Shuai in a moment or two, but first your own story. You've written this book, Red Roulette, which is about wealth, power and vengeance in China, following the disappearance of your ex-wife. It was published on the 4th anniversary of her disappearance. What actually do you think happened to her?
I think what happened is similar to Peng Shuai. It's I think in her case, it's association. In our case, it's associated with high politicians. So, as a detail in the book, we used to have business partnership with the wife of then Premier Wen Jiabao. And we also, obviously, through that relationship, we have established relationship with multiple high politicians in China.
But you, therefore, were part of the rich elite, and by your own admission, you're part of that whole kind of corporate and also corrupt elite system. Do you think that you just fell foul, she fell foul of the political system or indeed the money system and was removed immediately?
Yes. China it's all about political power. And especially once you're beyond certain level, it's all about money doesn't count for anything. That's, that you see the situation of Jack Ma or multiple billionaires of China. So money doesn't count for anything. It's all about political power.
But do you know, she was taken away, and also 2 or 3 members of her staff were taken away, not heard of, and you didn't hear from her, although you phoned and phoned and phoned, to the night before publication. What happened?
Nobody heard from her, not just me. Nobody have seen her, nobody have heard from her. Over that 4 years, she have never been charged, just vaporized, And I think she just probably solitary detention. And my guess is the reason she was taken was, there's 2 possibilities I was guessing. One is power politics. Xi Jinping is taking hostage against
supposedly spread the wealth
against possible political rival like Wen Jiabao. Or the other cases, because association with Sun Zhengcai, which is supposed to be actually to be successor of Xi Jinping next year.
She phoned you a night before publication, but it was already out in the Washington Post, and begged you not to publish it because she said the family would die, you might die, your son might die.
She made real threats. She asked the question, what would happen to our son if something happened to you? How will you feel if something happened to our son?
Did you feel that your life was in danger?
It's very hard to say, against a regime like China, anything is possible.
So the people have been disappeared from beyond the country, you say that in the book. But here in London, you feel safe, but there's no chance of actually finding where she is.
She's back. She's in Beijing. She had reappeared. She's back in her apartment with a limited, I think, to my knowledge, with limited access to people.
Right, but in the book you reckon that she was beaten, that you heard that she was beaten. Someone said.
No, I have no idea. I actually asked her, what happened. I asked her what's her charge on the first phone call she made to me.
So what do you think works best in China? Do you think overt criticism works best, as it would be for example, for Peng Shuai for the World Women's Tennis Association, or do you think the Olympics way, which is to go and engage in the Winter Olympics? Does either work?
Not really. I mean, China has their own agenda, and I think overt in today's China, overt doesn't work. You just have to confront them and put things straight up.
But you wrote a book, and that could not be more overt. And some of the things
Yes.
I mean, I gather this is hotly sought after in China.
Yeah.
And some of the things you say in it are extraordinary about your own business dealings and so forth. So
that book actually bring her out to you know, from Disappearance after 4 years.
So being overt did work because it brought her out of Disappearance to try and beg you not to publish it.
Yes.
But they must have known when they allowed her to speak to you that it was already out. They must have known that.
I think not necessarily. Otherwise, why would you ask her to make the call? I mean, it is, you know, they're forcing her to make the call, because, you know, bureaucrats in Beijing, they may believe that the way it works is like the rest of China. You know, I don't like a book, all books will disappear off the shelves of bookstores in China overnight.
Now, you went from being very critical of what was happening in Hong Kong to being part of it eventually. What do you think is the future for China? Do you think that we are going to have any form of democratization anytime soon?
I think that was never on Communist Party's agenda.
Do you think that we're moving towards a dictatorship with Xi Jinping's adoption of more powers for a longer period of time?
I think they're not moving toward it, they're already on it.
Mm-hmm. And can you ever see yourself ever going back to China?
Not going to happen. It's not just China, it's I can't even touch ground in Hong Kong, I think, these days.
You can't go anywhere?
Well, I can go many places at the Western democracy countries.
Thank you very much for coming in. Quick look at the front pages now, and we go to the Times. Jab results boost hope of beating Omicron. The dreadful story of the death of Arthur Labenjo Hughes. And there in the bottom, Duchess wins privacy legal battle. In the Telegraph, a bruise for every day of lockdown. Boy 6 died after being tortured by father and stepmother, despite the alarm being raised. And the story there of the Duchess, fears raised over privacy laws after the Duchess's victory. And finally in the Daily Mail, again, why didn't they save Arthur? And the top strap there, if Meghan really wanted to fight for the truth, she would come to court. And in a land of liberty, judges who are not awed by royalty and cherish a free press would allow a trial. Well, that's all from us tonight. I'm back tomorrow. Until then, from all of us here, good night.